She was a woman forged in the dust and the heat, her days measured not in hours, but in the slow, simmering alchemy of beans in a cast-iron pot. For years, this was her world. The smoky scent of paprika and cumin, the rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against metal, the low murmur of cowboys waiting to be fed. The ranch stretched out around her, a kingdom of grit and wind where she was merely a fixture, as permanent and as overlooked as the fence posts that lined the horizon. But then, the man who owned the ranch, the man who owned her days, was gone, and the silence he left behind was louder than any order he had ever shouted. She learned he was gone not with a bang, but with the unnerving stillness of a morning where his heavy boots did not shake the floorboards of the main house. She just kept cooking because what else was there to do when the world you knew ended? She cooked until a quiet ranch hand told her the truth, a truth that would change everything. This kingdom of dust, this pot of beans, this life, it all belonged to her now. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The beans bubbled, thick and brown, spitting little flecks of sauce onto the wood-fired stove. Ilara didn't flinch. The heat was a familiar companion, a constant pressure against her skin that mirrored the pressure in her soul. Mr. Sterling was dead. The doctor from town had come and gone, his buggy kicking up a cloud of ochre dust that settled on everything, a fine powder of finality. He had spoken in hushed, important tones about a weak heart, a life of hard living catching up. Ilara had stood by the kitchen door, her hands wrapped in her apron, her face a carefully constructed mask of impassive grief. Inside, a tempest raged. Was it grief? Or was it the terrifying, exhilarating shock of a cage door swinging open to reveal a world she no longer knew how to navigate? The cowboys ate their meal in a strangely subdued manner that evening. They took their plates of beans and cornbread and sat on the porch steps, their usual boisterous talk reduced to low, uncertain whispers. They looked at the main house, its windows dark and empty, as if expecting a ghost to appear and reprimand them for their quiet. They did not look at her. They never really looked at her. She was the provider of sustenance, a pair of hands, a function. Her existence was tied to the fire in the stove and the food on their plates. Now the man who lit that fire, metaphorically, was extinguished. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind that swept across the plains, began to seep into Ilara's bones. The routine was all she had. The beans, the bread, the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning. It was her penance and her shield. Without Sterling's shadow looming over her, she felt exposed, adrift in a silence that was deafening. The question hung in the air, unspoken but felt by every soul on that ranch. What happens now? The days that followed blurred into a monotonous haze, each one a pale imitation of the last, only now hollowed out, absent of the oppressive weight of his presence. Ilara continued her duties with a mechanical precision, her body moving through the familiar choreography of the kitchen, while her mind spun in a frantic, silent circle. The cowboys, stripped of their master, seemed to revert to a more primal state. Their conversations, once held in check by Sterling's temper, grew louder, coarser. They spoke of the future as if it were a horse to be broken, a wild thing to be tamed and claimed. They spoke of the ranch's vast acreage, of the cattle herds, of the money. They never spoke of her. She would stand by the window, watching them, a ghost in her own home, listening to their careless speculations. Old man Sterling had no kin, one would say, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Reckon the state takes it. Another, a burly man named Gus with hands like worn leather, would scoff. State ain't got no use for this place. It'll go to the man strong enough to hold it. Their eyes would scan the group, sizing each other up, a pack of wolves sensing a vacuum of power. Ilara felt a familiar bitterness rise in her throat. To them she was part of the property, a domestic asset that would convey with the deed. The thought was so deeply ingrained in her own sense of self that it barely registered as an insult anymore. It was simply a fact, like the rising of the sun. But in the quiet moments late at night when the only sound was the sighing of the wind, a memory would surface, sharp and cruel. She saw Sterling's face, contorted with rage over a meal served 5 minutes late. She felt the phantom sting of his words, how he called her useless, a stray he'd been foolish enough to take in. He had never raised a hand to her, not physically. His cruelty was more insidious, a slow, methodical erosion of her spirit, leaving her convinced of her own worthlessness. He had kept her small, trapped in the kitchen, so that his own kingdom would seem larger. The grief she thought she should feel was absent, replaced by a vast empty space inside her and a fear of what or who would rush in to fill it. Silas, the oldest of the ranch hands, was the only one who seemed untouched by the shifting dynamics. He moved with a quiet dignity, his dark eyes missing nothing. He would sometimes catch her gaze from across the yard, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression before he would turn back to his work. His silence was different from the others. It was not empty, but full, weighted with a knowledge she couldn't begin to comprehend. The fragile, unspoken truce held for a week. Then, Jebediah made his move. Jeb was younger than the others, with a swagger that had always grated on Alara's nerves. He had a mean streak that Sterling had occasionally found amusing, and had therefore encouraged. He saw himself as the heir apparent, the natural successor to Sterling's brand of casual tyranny. He started by taking Sterling's seat at the head of the long, scarred wooden table in the main house, a place no one had dared to occupy. The other cowboys watched, a mixture of resentment and grudging respect in their eyes. Alara served the food, her movements stiff. She placed the pot of beans in the center of the table, as always, but when she turned to leave, Jeb's voice cut through the air. "Woman, pour my coffee." It was not a request. The word woman hung in the air, a deliberate assertion of his new self-appointed status. The other men fell silent, their forks hovering over their plates. This was a test. Everything was a test. For a heartbeat, Alara froze. The years of conditioning, of instant, unquestioning obedience, warred with a new and unfamiliar feeling. A hot, sharp spike of defiance. It was a foreign sensation, so alien it almost frightened her. She could feel every eye in the room on her, waiting. She turned slowly, her face betraying nothing of the inferno roaring inside her. Her gaze met Jeb's. He smirked, a cruel, confident twist of his lips. He believed he had already won. For years, she had been a creature of submission, her will bent and reshaped by a master who demanded nothing less. But the master was gone, and in his absence, something deep within her, something she thought had long since withered and died, began to stir. It was a tiny, fragile thing, but it was there. A sense of self. She walked to the stove, picked up the heavy coffee pot, and walked back to the table. The men watched, holding their breath. From the corner of her eye, through the kitchen doorway that led to the yard, she saw Silas. He was standing by the water pump, ostensibly washing his hands, but his posture was rigid, his attention fixed on the drama unfolding inside. He was a silent sentinel, a witness. Alara reached Jeb's place and began to pour the coffee, her hand steady. Jeb's smirk widened, and then she did not stop pouring. The hot black liquid filled his cup, spilled over the sides, and pooled on the wooden table, a steaming, dark stain that spread like a creeping shadow. Jeb leaped to his feet with a curse, but Alara did not flinch. She simply set the pot down and looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze as cold and hard as stone. Her life on the ranch had not begun with a choice, but with a surrender. She was 17, her family's name ruined by a father who had gambled away their modest farm, leaving them with nothing but shame. Mr. Sterling had arrived like a dark savior, a man of immense presence and quiet power who knew her father. He'd offered her a position, a way to escape the pitying glances and whispered judgments of their small town. He'd called it a fresh start. Alara, young and desperate, had seen it as a lifeline. She hadn't understood then that some lifelines are merely gilded chains. In the beginning, he had been almost kind, in a distant, proprietary way. He had shown her the sprawling ranch, the endless sky, the sheer scale of his domain. He had made her feel small, not with words, but with the silent, overwhelming evidence of his power. And he had led her to the kitchen. "A ranch runs on a full stomach," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "You will cook. You will start with the beans. The men like beans." That first day he had stood over her, instructing her on the exact ratio of spices, the precise soaking time, the slow, patient simmer required. It was not a recipe. It was a ritual. The beans became the anchor of her existence, a symbol of her purpose and her prison. Day after day, year after year, the task remained the same. It was the first thing she did in the morning and the last thing she cleaned up at night. The smell clung to her clothes, her hair, her skin. It was the scent of her servitude. Over time, the kindness, however thin, had evaporated, replaced by a constant, low-grade irritation. He corrected her, criticized her, and controlled her every move. He never wanted her in the main house except to clean it when he was away. Her small room off the kitchen was her world. He had systematically isolated her, cutting her off from the few friendships she might have formed with the wives of neighboring ranchers, ensuring her entire existence revolved around him and the needs of his men. She was his, another asset, like a prize bull or a fertile patch of land. This slow, grinding erosion of her identity had left her hollow. She forgot the girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of more than a dusty horizon. She became Ilara, the cook, a woman defined by a single, repetitive act, and she had, on some level, accepted it. It was easier than fighting a battle she knew she could not win. It was easier than admitting her lifeline had been a lie. Now, standing in the aftermath of her small rebellion against Jeb, the memory of that 17-year-old girl felt like a ghost haunting her. The spilled coffee on the table was more than just an act of defiance. It was a crack in the foundation of the person she had been forced to become. It was the first time in 2 decades she had done something that was entirely, truly her own. A strange energy now hummed in the air of the ranch, a current of unspoken tension. Jebediah, humiliated and furious, treated her with a venomous silence, his glares like tiny daggers. The other men were uncertain, their rough-hewn respect shifting. They saw a flicker of something in her they hadn't seen before, and it made them wary. For Ilara, the world had tilted on its axis. The kitchen, once her cage, now felt like a fortress, and from within its walls a new, dangerous emotion began to bloom. Curiosity. Her entire life here had been circumscribed by rules, both spoken and unspoken. The most rigid of these rules concerned Sterling's office. It was his sanctuary, a place she was permitted to enter only to dust, and only under his watchful eye. He had always been obsessively private about his desk, a massive oak monolith that dominated the room. One drawer, the wide one in the center, was always locked. He kept the key on his person at all times. Now the office was just a room, silent and steeped in the scent of old paper and leather. The desk was just a piece of furniture, but to Ilara, it was a sleeping dragon. For days she resisted its pull. She told herself it was none of her business. Sterling's secrets had died with him, but the thought of the locked drawer became an obsession. What did a man like Sterling, a man who owned everything and everyone he saw, feel the need to hide so carefully? What secret was so precious that it required a lock and key in a house where he was the undisputed king? The thought gnawed at her, a relentless whisper in the back of her mind. One afternoon when the men were out on the far ranges, a deep quiet settled over the ranch house. The only sound was the buzzing of a lone fly against a window pane. Ilara found herself standing at the threshold of the office. The air inside was thick, stagnant with the ghost of his authority. She walked to the desk, her heart pounding a heavy, fearful rhythm against her ribs. She ran her fingers over the polished wood, the surface cool and smooth. She tugged at the handle of the center drawer. It was solid, unyielding, locked. Of course it was locked. A wave of frustration and helplessness washed over her. It was a final, posthumous act of control. He was gone, but his power lingered, embedded in the very wood and steel of his domain. She sank into his large leather chair, the seat sighing under her weight. It felt like a profound transgression. From this vantage point, she could see the entire yard, the corrals, the bunkhouse, the vast, unforgiving plains stretching to the edge of the world. For the first time, she was looking out from the seat of power, and it felt both terrifying and intoxicating. The kingdom was without a king, and she was sitting on its empty throne. The sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, when Silas found her. She was not in the kitchen. She had abandoned the beans, leaving them to cool on the stove. Instead, she stood by the corral, watching the horses mill about in the fading light, their quiet strength a comfort. She didn't hear him approach. His steps were as soft on the earth as falling leaves. He came to stand beside her, not too close, respecting the space around her. They stood in silence for a long time, two solitary figures against the immense backdrop of the twilight sky. The silence between them was not the empty, tense quiet of the dining room, but something else entirely. It was a shared quiet, a space where words were not yet necessary. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, a sound that seemed to rise from the very land itself. "He wasn't the man you thought he was," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. The statement was simple, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. Alara turned to look at him, truly look at him, for the first time. His face was a roadmap of a long, hard life, but his eyes were clear and deep, holding a wisdom that felt ancient. "And what man did I think he was?" she asked, her own voice barely a whisper. Silas finally turned his head, and his eyes met hers. There was no pity in them, only a profound, sorrowful understanding. "You thought he was strong," he said. "He wasn't. He was afraid. Every single day of his life." The words made no sense. Sterling? Afraid? The man had been a monolith of arrogance and power. But Silas spoke with such unshakable certainty that a sliver of doubt pierced through her long-held beliefs. Silas reached into the pocket of his worn denim jacket and pulled out a small, ornate, and very old-looking key. It was made of brass, tarnished with age, its design delicate and feminine. It was nothing like the heavy, utilitarian keys Sterling had carried. "This was my mother's," he said, holding it out to her on his calloused palm. "She worked in this house, before you, long before." Alara stared at the key, a relic from a past she knew nothing about. The ranch's history, as she knew it, had begun with her arrival. The time before was a blank slate. "What is this for?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Silas's expression was grim. "Some locks are not made of steel," he said cryptically. "They are made of secrets. Sterling kept many secrets, but he wasn't the first." He gently closed her fingers around the cool metal of the key. "You went looking for a key to a drawer. That's the wrong lock." With that, he nodded once, a gesture of finality, and walked away, melting back into the deepening shadows of the evening, leaving Alara standing with the weight of a new and much deeper mystery in her hand. The brass key felt heavy in her hand, a tangible link to a history she had never been allowed to know. That night she did not sleep. She sat in the dark kitchen, the key clutched in her fist, her mind racing. Some locks are not made of steel. Silas's words echoed, turning over and over. She thought of the desk, of the locked center drawer, and knew with a sudden startling intuition that he was right. The secret wasn't in the obvious place. The next day, under the pretext of cleaning, she returned to the office. The room felt different now, charged with possibility. She ignored the main drawer, and instead let her fingers trace the ornate carvings on the sides of the massive oak desk. Her hands searched for something out of place, a seam, a catch, a trick of the light. On the side, hidden from the doorway, her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation in the wood, no bigger than her thumb. Pressing it, she heard a faint click. A narrow section of the carved paneling sprang open, revealing not a drawer, but a hidden vertical compartment, dark and deep. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling hands, she reached inside. Her fingers closed around a bundle of papers, tied with a faded ribbon, and a slim, leather-bound ledger. She took them back to the kitchen, her sanctuary, and laid them on the table. The key Silas had given her was not for the compartment itself, but for a small, locked cash box she found nestled at the very bottom. Inside were not coins or bills, but more letters, older and more fragile. She untied the ribbon on the first bundle. The letters were written in a strong, masculine hand. They were from Sterling's father to a woman named Eleanor Vance, Silas's mother. The words were not those of an employer to a servant, but of a man consumed by a tormented conscience. They spoke of a terrible debt and a grievous sin against her family. Alara's hands shook as she opened the ledger. The columns of numbers and spidery script told a story far darker than she could have imagined. It was a meticulous record of a swindle. Decades ago, this land, this entire ranch, had not belonged to the Sterlings. It had belonged to the Vance family, Silas's family. Sterling's father, a man of cunning and ruthlessness, had exploited a drought and a series of misfortunes, leveraging a small loan into a mountain of manufactured debt. and had legally, perfidiously, stolen the land from Silas's grandfather. The ranch was built on a foundation of deceit. Her entire life here, her servitude, Sterling's tyranny, it was all a charade enacted on a stolen stage. He wasn't the king of a domain he had rightfully inherited. He was the fearful warden of a crime scene. The beans, the kitchen, the way he had kept her small and powerless, it was all part of the same desperate act. To feel like a master of a place he knew deep in his soul he had no right to. The truth did not set her free. It crashed down on her like a physical weight, knocking the air from her lungs. She sat at the kitchen table, the letters in the ledger spread out before her like the wreckage of a life, not just her life, but Silas's and his mother's and his grandfather's before him, a legacy of theft and silence. She looked around the kitchen, at the worn floorboards, the soot-stained stove, the thick, unyielding walls of the house, and saw it all for what it was, a monument to a lie. Sterling's cruelty was suddenly cast in a new, horrifying light. It wasn't the casual arrogance of a powerful man. It was the desperate, frantic bullying of a weak one. His need to control her, to diminish her, was a reflection of his own profound insecurity, the constant gnawing knowledge that his entire identity was fraudulent. He had inherited his father's sin, and it had poisoned him from the inside out. He had lived his life as an imposter, and his rage was the only way he knew how to silence the ghosts. This understanding did not bring forgiveness. It brought a cold, sharp clarity that was almost more painful than the years of ignorance. She had been a prisoner, but her jailer had been a prisoner too, trapped in a cage of his own family's making. She found Silas by the stables, mending a bridle with slow, methodical movements. He looked up as she approached, his expression revealing no surprise. He had been waiting for her. She didn't need to speak. She simply held out the bundle of letters. He took them, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle on the fragile paper, and looked at them with a deep, familiar sadness. "My mother told me the stories," he said, his voice quiet. "She kept her own copies of some letters, the ones his father sent her, but she never knew about the ledger. She just knew the land was ours. It was a hurt she carried to her grave." He explained the rest. His family had been forced to stay on as laborers, working the very ground that had been stolen from them. It was a cruel, twisted form of bondage. His mother, Eleanor, had worked in the house, a constant silent reminder of the Sterling family's crime. And when she passed, Silas had stayed, a quiet observer, a keeper of a history that the world had forgotten. "He kept you cooking beans in that kitchen," Silas said, his gaze hard as flint as he looked toward the main house, because as long as someone was serving him in this house, he could pretend he belonged in it. He needed you to be small, so he could feel big enough to fill his father's stolen shoes. The words struck Alara with profound force. It was the truth, the core of it all. Her years of suffering had been nothing more than a prop in one man's pathetic lifelong performance. The confrontation came as she knew it must at supper time. The men filed in, their faces grimy with the day's dust, their hunger making them loud and impatient. Jebediah, who had been nursing his grudge for days, swaggered to the head of the table. He slammed his palm down on the wood. "Beans are cold," he announced to the room, though his challenge was aimed squarely at Alara. "And there's no coffee. Seems the service around here has gone to hell since the old man died." He was baiting her, trying to re-establish the old order, the one where she was a faceless servant and he was a rising power. The other men watched. Their forks paused, a silent audience to the inevitable clash. A few weeks ago, the accusation would have sent a jolt of fear through her. She would have stammered an apology, rushed to fix her mistake, to placate him. But the woman who had spent the afternoon reading through the sins of the past was not the same woman who had served them last night. She stood by the stove, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight and unwavering. She did not move. "If you want hot coffee, Jebediah," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the suddenly silent room, "the pot is on the stove. You have 2 hands. I suggest you use them." A collective intake of breath. Jeb's face flushed a deep mottled red. He pushed his chair back, its legs scraping violently against the floor, and stood up, his fists clenched. "You forget your place, woman," he snarled, taking a menacing step towards her. "This ranch needs a boss, and you need to be reminded of who gives the orders." He was posturing, playing to the crowd, trying to bully her back into submission. But Alara did not retreat. She held his gaze. Her own eyes filled not with fear, but with a cold, resolute fire he had never seen before. She was about to speak, to unleash the torrent of truth she now held, when a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas stepped into the kitchen. He moved without a sound, positioning himself not in front of Alara, but beside her. A quiet, unshakable wall of support. His presence shifted the balance of power in the room instantly. Jeb faltered, his bravado wavering in the face of Silas's profound stillness. "This has nothing to do with you, old man," Jeb spat, trying to recover his footing. Silas's gaze was heavy, ancient. He looked past Jeb, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the other men, and then he looked at Alara, a deep and meaningful glance that spoke volumes. Then he looked back at Jeb, his expression unyielding. He spoke, and his voice, though quiet, resonated with the weight of absolute authority. "You're wrong," Silas said. "This all belongs to you now." He was looking directly at Alara. The statement hung in the air, electric and incomprehensible. Jebediah let out a short, ugly laugh. "What did you say? She owns this?" He gestured around the room, at the rough-hewn walls, the table, the entire world they inhabited. "The cook? You've been out in the sun too long, old man." The other cowboys murmured in agreement, their confusion turning to derision. The idea was absurd, a fantasy. Alara, too, was stunned into silence, looking at Silas, her heart hammering against her ribs. What did he mean? Was this a metaphor? A grand, poetic gesture? But Silas's expression was not poetic. It was factual. It was the expression of a man stating an irrefutable truth. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the same one where he'd kept his mother's key, and this time he withdrew a thick, folded envelope, its edges worn, its paper yellowed with age. He held it up. "Mr. Sterling was a lot of things," Silas said, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the murmurs. "He was a cruel man. He was a weak man. And he was a guilty man. He lived his whole life with a poison in his soul. And at the end, I think he wanted to find some kind of peace." He placed the envelope on the table, in the very center, on top of the cold pot of beans. "This is his last will and testament. He wrote it 5 years ago. He gave it to me for safekeeping, because he didn't trust himself not to burn it on a bad day. And he knew I would honor his final wish." Jeb stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. "You're lying." Silas ignored him. He looked at Alara, his eyes conveying the full, staggering weight of what was to come. "He left the ranch, the house, the cattle, everything. To you, Alara." A wave of dizziness washed over her. The room seemed to tilt. Her? It made no sense. Why? Why would a man who treated her with such contempt leave her his entire kingdom? Silas seemed to read her mind. "But there is a condition," he continued, his voice dropping slightly. "It is a legal and binding codicil. The will stipulates that a full 50% of the land, specifically the original Vance homestead, on the eastern range, along with half of all future profits from the entire ranching operation, are to be deeded, free and clear, to the last surviving descendant of Eleanor Vance." He paused, letting the words settle. "That descendant is me." The room was utterly, completely silent. The cowboys stared, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. It was not a gift. It was an act of restitution, a desperate final attempt at atonement from a dying man. Sterling hadn't just given Alara the ranch. He had given her the power and the legal obligation to right the wrong that had haunted his family for 2 generations. He had bound her and Silas together, 2 prisoners of his legacy, and finally given them the key.